Let's start. So my name is Amos, and I'm extremely happy and also excited, literally, to open this evening where we host Prančceska Albanese, who is the special rapporteur for the occupied UN.
Just a second, Amos. Karine, are you checking up that we are recording?
We are recording.
It says recording.
Okay.
Anyhow, so I'm very happy and excited and to host in Academia for Equality, Prančceska Albanese, who is the special UN rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. We had a discussion online, and we also hosted Itai Mark on her very important report that she issued just recently. And we are very happy to hear about this report and about what she thinks, and also to have a discussion over this. So the rules of the game are as follows. Prančceska will open with a 10 minutes introduction on the role of a special rapporteur and the basic principles of and bullet points of the seems to her most important in her report. Following that, attorneys Sausan Zaher and Moshe Shiko Behar will respond each 12 minutes, and then Prančceska will have another 10 to 12 minutes to respond, and we will open it after 45 minutes to discussion with the whole group. So I will very briefly introduce all three, and we will start. Prančceska Albanese is an international lawyer, former UN official with 20 years of work in the field of human rights. She is the author of a number of relevant publications on Palestine, Israel, including Palestinian refugees in international law, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Currently divided between academia and legal work, she is the head of the teaching forced displacement and legal work. She is the head of the migrant and refugee program for ARD, a legal aid organization based in Jordan. She is also, as we said, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories as of May 2022. Attorney Sausan Zaher specializes in human rights and constitutional law and manages a private practice based in Haifa. She represents Palestinians from both sides of the Green Line and has litigated landmark cases before the Israeli Supreme Court. She also works in the Human Rights Clinic at Tel Aviv University. Sausan worked in Adala Legal Center for 13 years until 2021 and served as the Deputy General Director. In 2013, she was a fellow at Yale University. In 2008, a fellow in Columbia University. And last but not least, of course, Moshe Shiko Behar holds a PhD in comparative politics from Columbia University and is Associate Professor in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies in University of Manchester. His recent work is titled Competing Marxism, Cessation of Colonialism, Settler Colonialism, and the One-State Solution in Israel-Palestine. It was published in the Arab and Jewish Question, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond, edited by Bashir and Laila Farsakh, Columbia University Press, 2020. So, Prančceska, after all these introductions, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone, friends, colleagues, distinguished scholars. I'm deeply grateful to the Academia for Equality Network for organizing this event and for inviting me. And of course, I'm grateful to the distinguished discussants, Susan and Moshe, who agreed to offer their insights on my report and presentation. And last but not least, I'm grateful to Professor Amos Goldberg, the real matchmaker of this encounter. I've been asked to present two critical points of my report, which is challenging because, of course, I had to pick what I found the most significant aspects of it. But before I do so, I thought it was opportune to also give a sense of what is my role as a UN Special Rapporteur, as not everyone in the audience might be familiar with its functions. Special Rapporteurs are individuals appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council for an up to 6-year term to report to the Council itself and to the General Assembly on specific human rights issues that they have a relevant expertise on, being them thematic, like freedom of expression, the right to health, human rights defenders of torture, or geographic areas. And this is my case. My mandate was created in 1993 to report on Israel's violations of international law in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Namely, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. I am the 8th and first woman to hold this role. Special rapporteurs are due to base their reports primarily on country visits, two per year, normally. But among the 14 country-specific special rapporteurs, in my case, this is de facto prevented from Israel, despite the fact that I'm officially invited, I mean, and other special rapporteurs before me by Palestinian authorities to visit the OPT. An important point is that special rapporteur's position is voluntary, so it's unpaid and is not subject to the same administrative discipline of any UN civil servant. So both features strengthen our capacity to be independent, critical human rights voices within the UN system. We like to define ourselves as the crown jewel of the UN, using the over-enthusiastic words of former Secretary General, late Kofi Annan. And in fact, we also play, this is my case, I'm often a critical voice of the UN itself. My first report to the General Assembly, focusing on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people within the occupied Palestinian territory, so neither referring to the Palestinian people as a whole in Israel or in exile, nor the right of Israel to exist, has sparked quite an interesting debate. I decided to focus on the right of self-determination for two reasons. Because this right is foundational to all other rights and is recognized as inalienable to the Palestinian people, and yet it remains unrealized. But also because despite being central to the international consensus on the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, the legal meaning of it, its legal implications are either absent or gravely misunderstood in the current international debate. So here are the two critical contributions I believe the report makes. First, the clarification of what is the meaning and what are the implications for the Palestinian people within the occupied Palestinian territory. The right of self-determination is the right of all rights. It's what empowers a recognized grouping to exist and live as a people, determining their political status and pursuing their economic, social, and cultural development independently and free from alien domination and interference. The nature of this right for the lawyers and non-lawyers among you as a peremptory norm of international law is such that it admits no derogations and creates erga omnes obligations. What does it mean? That every state member of the United Nations is obliged to make sure that this right is realized. Instead, what has happened since 1967 is that the reality of the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip has been marked not only by numerous and systemic violations, but by what identified as an intentional violation of the right of self-determinations. Four constitutive elements. First, territorial sovereignty, which is necessary to develop an independent Palestinian state, which Israel violates by seizing, annexing, fragmenting the occupied territory, and transferring its own civilian population into it, which is a war crime in and of itself. Second, by preventing and violating the sovereignty over natural resources, which are necessary to develop an independent Palestinian economy, which Israel violates by extracting and exploiting natural resources in the territory it occupies. And third, by preventing and repressing the cultural existence of and as a people of the Palestinians under occupation, which Israel violates by appropriating, erasing, suppressing most symbols of Palestinian identity, being them a flag, a curricular, political, social, religious institutions or manifestations. And fourth, last but not least, by violating and repressing the expression of political will, which is violated by Israel's interference with the formation of an unfettered polity through a variety of means, which includes targeted killings of political and religious leaders and outright repression of political activity, including the work of human rights defenders. Of course, this is a very brutal synthesis, but this is all documented and supported by facts analyzed against the prism of international law. Because this has been accompanied by a conduct of displaced the local Palestinians under occupation and to replace them with its own citizen and Israel's occupation, I define Israel's occupation settler colonial, advanced under the pretense of an occupation maintained for security reasons under the watch of the same international community that vowed to end colonialism 60 years ago. The second critical point I wanted to share is what I call the paradigm shift that I propose in the way the Israel-Palestine question is approached based on the realization of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination in the form of an independent state in the territory currently occupied. Because again, I insist, this is what the international consensus that has formed over the past decades is about. So the paradigm entails moving away from the narrative of conflict and the call for a negotiated solution, which doesn't even acknowledge the subordinate status of the Palestinians. And I've crafted this argument looking particularly at what Western states continue to recite as a mantra, the two-state solution, but without looking at the vanishing, the diminishing conditions, material conditions for the realization of that state. And they call for the recognition of the situation for what it is. An occupation which is not only illegal because not temporary, because it entails multiple violations of the law of occupation and human rights law, and it's clearly it has clearly translated into annexation, de jure and de facto, of large portions of the occupied territory. But again, because it's sustained by a logic of displace, replace, repress, and contain the Palestinian, that is leading to a de-Palestinianization of most of the occupied territory that has, of course, morphed into an apartheid regime and therefore is quintessentially inadmissible under international law. Second element of this paradigm shift is what I call resetting the mind on what is to be done. Again, reestablishing the primacy of international law as central to resolve the enduring reality in the OPT, and not as an option among other conflict resolutions tools. Next, stop treating the symptoms, meaning the individual violations that take place in the OPT as if they were out of a context, or treating the situation in the OPT as a humanitarian crisis to manage. Of course, there are humanitarian emergencies, but again, we should not miss the root causes and the symptoms. And of course, the other critical element is that the question cannot be solved through economic development only. Again, the rights of the people living under occupation have to be realized first. The end of the occupation is a sine qua non condition for Palestinians to enjoy their inalienable right to self-determination in the form of an independent state. Then the terms of a political solution can be discussed. Despite the distressing present, I'm convinced that a way out is possible, but international law is to be the driving force behind politics rather than the other way around. Voila, this is in a nutshell what my report is about.
Thank you very much and for keeping the time. And now we go to Elsa.
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to respond to this important report of Prančceska. I will try to provide my response in bullet points. First of all, I think that This is a very important report because also first of all, it tackles the framework, the general legal framework of the situation and the narrative that should be adopted instead of only tackling the violation here and there within the framework of occupation, which has been done so far. But I think that the importance of the report doesn't come only just because it suggests one way to tackle the or to basically to narrate the framework, which is the right to self-determination in a context of settler colonialism. I think that the importance is, first of all, that it comes out of a UN personnel, official personnel, a special rapporteur such as Prančcesca Albanese, and especially that it hasn't been the first time that the UN have been trying to tackle the situation in Palestine with legal terms. In 2017, Richard Falk and Virginia Tilly also published by the UN, the ESCOA, UN ESCOA, they published a report where they basically tackled the whole Israeli regime in 1948 and in 1967 as an apartheid. It immediately was confronted with a huge public critique to an extent that it basically was decided not to discuss it anymore, and it is until now on the website of the ESCOA of the UN, but it wasn't published further on, and no discussion, and all the discussions on it stopped because of the critique on having a narrative of apartheid by the UN on the report. That was in 2017. In 2019, we see that there was another development by the UN Third Committee, where for the first time in its concluding observation after it concluded the Israeli report in the committee, they for the first time tackled the framework as institutionalized racial discrimination, which is equivalent to the framework of apartheid. It was also historic back then. It was a constitutional, a legal moment for the paradigm shift back then, if I may say, and it basically opened a legitimate window for the reports of the organizations, the local ones and the international ones. That was in 2019. So by no chance we see that afterwards Yesh Din issued their publication basically describing or stating that in 1960 the occupied territory there's the crime of apartheid, analyzing it from the components of the criminal crime of apartheid. Then came the report of B'Tselem, which basically tried to describe the regime rather than the crime of apartheid, the Israeli regime in 1948 and in 67 as a regime of apartheid, but of course that was not a criminal legal discourse. And then, as you know, we had the Human Rights Report and the Amnesty International report, which also came and tried to look on provide a holistic framework to the situation by basically tackling or describing or trying to meet the definitions of apartheid in 1948 and in 1967. So the report, Prančcesca report now as an official that comes basically and kind of, it doesn't wrap up because Prančcesca, as she said, she tries to offer a paradigm shift, which if you can mute, please. Yeah. Everyone, if you can mute, thank you. So basically the importance is, again, that vis-a-vis the 2017 report, which was not discussed, and now Prančcesca's report, which openly comes and says, not only it's not enough to talk about apartheid, but we need to do the shift and start talking about self-determination as part of settler colonialism. This in itself itself is a huge, not only legal statement, but a political statement that a UN personnel is doing a shift in the framework, moving from international violation, moving from only talking about occupation to a more holistic framework. Now, do I agree or I don't agree? Now, on the one hand, tackling the situation with self-determination discourse is very important, especially like, for example, from my side, that I come from a human rights perspective. The right to self-determination indeed is the most important inalienable rights in international law. But I don't think that it is enough. Like, it is enough to tackle the issue from a human rights perspective. But on the other hand, I think it's very important to take all what have been published until now, whether it is, and not take it as a fragmentation of reports, because one report would say only in 1967 there is a crime of apartheid. Another report, all the regime is apartheid. Another publication, it would say, let's talk about settler colonialism. Another would talk, let's talk about the holistic view. And then Pranč'seka comes and say, let's talk about the right to self-determination. I think that maybe this fragmentation would have been interesting and relevant maybe 5 years ago, when the beginning of the narrative, of the narration and the shift started. But I think the fact that now we are in a situation that there is no need to continue to try to describe the situation, because the extreme right wing, after the election and the results of the elections, are making the mission very easy for all of us. They basically, from their point, they don't care if we call it occupation, if we put it in the framework of occupation only. Neither do they care if it's the framework of apartheid or self-determination. They don't care, and they don't even try to hide that they don't care. So I think that if we take all the fragments of all these reports or all these paradigms, no matter how you look on it, of course, everyone has some pros and cons. Like, for example, self-determination alone doesn't ensure criminal liability. If we talk about apartheid, it does ensure criminal liability, because it's also a crime based on the UN Convention on apartheid from the 70s, and it's also a war crime in the Rome Statute. Now, if we're saying colonialism, that's also a crime that is defined in international law, while settler colonialism is not exactly defined in international law. So when we want to say that there's a settler colonial regime, how can we tackle it on a level of violation of international law? Now, this is very important, tackling the remedy. What can we achieve if we call end of apartheid? Is it enough, for example, to call end apartheid or end occupation or provide self-determination? I think every narrative or every paradigm results in a different remedy, which is not enough independently and on its own. For example, if we take the paradigm of apartheid alone and we say end apartheid, the meaning is having equality for both sides. But having equality for both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, in 1948 and in 1967 is not enough, because there's still the occupation to tackle. If we're talking about self-determination, again, there's provide the self-determination, even if it eventually means basically establishing a state for the Palestinians. But then the question is, what about the self-determination of Palestinians inside of Israel? Because the report of Pranč'seka, as much as it is important, it basically emphasized 1967, maybe as part of your mandate, Pranč'seka, but still it basically misses and doesn't matter what the limitations were, it misses countering the violations of Israel towards the Palestinians in 1948. Now, I think the holistic view of all these paradigms, having not one only right and one wrong, is very important, because all of them, there are some mutual important things under all these paradigms. And the mutual issues is, first of all, that we know that there is Jewish supremacy in all of these paradigms. We know that there is that this Jewish supremacy leads for a domination, and have been leading for domination of one group over the other. And we also know that there is an intent that all the domination and the Jewish supremacy have been there from the beginning until now, and will continue to exist intentionally. And this is also the intent component is very important in Pranč'ska's report, because proving intent is very important, whether we want to show that there is a violation of the right to self-determination, or because it's a component of the crime of apartheid, or because it's a part of the colonial framework and structure, and also because of the prolonged occupation. So I think that I still have 1 minute. Now, I think that the fact that we have several paradigms trying to tackle the legal and political situation now might, like the timing now, especially with the newest resolution of the UN to refer the question, the legal question of the prolonged occupation to the ICJ is very, very important, because I think that an expert opinion from the ICJ on what does it mean, what is the legal consequences of the violation of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian and the prolonged occupation will tackle all the paradigms. It probably, hopefully, this is what I hope, will tackle it in a holistic view, and will join forces by all of these paradigms and all of these reports, whether it's by Pranč'ska or by the ESCOA or by all the local and international organizations. Thank you.
Thank you also for this concise response and standing in time. Chico, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, San, I just really hope that you will be right, of course. I happened to be in The Hague in 2004 with Azmi Pshara, demonstrating against the Israelis that were trying to frustrate the ruling of the ICJ in The Hague. And okay, so the report came out, and we're almost 20 years later. And you know, not too much happened. So Amos, unfortunately, my printer is out, so I can't see you. So you will need to, you know, stop me violently. So I mean, I'm very honored, of course, to be provided with the opportunity to speak here. I truly think that it's most of our Academic for Equality is undoubtedly one of the most knowledgeable groups on earth in relation to the question of Palestine, Israel. At the same time, we are all activist scholars, and we are remarkably diverse. And as such, we of course approach the question of Palestine, Israel from very many disciplines and angles. So, for example, as Amos mentioned, I happen to be approaching the question of Palestine, Israel from the disciplinary vantage point of comparative politics. So it also means that my knowledge of international law, for example, cannot and also does not match the ones of Sausan and Pranč'ska, who are not only legal scholars, but I think also lawyers. So what happened to me here that I'm a bit stuck with lawyers. And what I'm suggesting is that it may also be a little bit of a problem, because I mean, here, I mean, it almost came across as if lawyers or international law is somehow going to solve us or get us out of the mess, which actually is not my view. I tend to believe that maybe some of the problems we are facing is because of lawyers. So this is why I'm going to approach the report in a different manner a little bit. So let me just say, I mean, as a practical and someone who tends to be a materialist and a little bit simplistic, so I get Palestine, you know, earns countless amount of texts, articles, books, blogs, a lot, right? So you're overwhelmed with all the material. So I'm sorry to say, I'm almost like a student. What is the first thing I do nowadays with the technology? I do Control F. Control F, I get the box and insert terms to see what's going on because we don't have a lot of time. So the first term concept that I insert in every text that I get, every text, right, is the concept binational. And the other one is binationalism. And I also write binational with a hyphen, just in case that some people spell it differently. And in 95% of the time, I get 0 results. And that's also the case in relation to the report of Pranč'seka, despite the fact that, of course, amazingly, and I think it's a good way, it highlights the phenomenon of nationalism or the right of national self-determination, but it doesn't include the word binational. Okay, so the second thing that I do usually, I simply insert the word, the Haifa Declaration, and then the future vision of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And also they didn't come up. So I found Tom Segev, Herzl, Ilan Pape, Patrick Wolf in the Journal of Genocide Studies. I found them, but I didn't find any reference to these two documents. I'm just sending them now here because why I'm mentioning them? I'm mentioning them because for me, as a subjective observer of the question of Palestine-Israel, these two documents are the most important documents that were written in the 21st century in relation to the question of Palestine. That's my view as an individual, right? So I think that I am hoping to find more citations and discussions of these documents, because if we have a way out of the mess where we are, they provide us the vista to do it. And I didn't see until now, I've been teaching the question of Palestine-Israel in England 17 years. There's not no other document that can provide a pathway out. So that's why I mentioned them. And I was a bit saddened to see that they are not mentioned in the report. And then finally, if I may, and of course I'm not a lawyer, I also ordinarily, when I get texts or reports or books about Palestine, and I also try to find some information about the pre-1950s and the post-1950s historical experiences of non-European and non-white Jews such as myself. And also there's a minority of non-white Jews in the Zoom here. Of course, they are not represented here because this is a constituency that you don't talk to, and it's not present. So I didn't also find much, a little bit about him, something about Jewish history, but mainly European, and I think it was section 36 or 26, can't remember, but it's not there. The reason I say it is not because I love myself or all Arab Jews, is just because Mizrahi Jews comprise 50% of the Jewish population between the river and the sea, and I think that it's good to understand them in relation to international law, and they definitely have something to say about settler colonial studies, and also their case is a little bit interesting in relation to this field. So this is some notes that I hope some other participants may pick up later in the discussion, and I'm moving to the report now to what there is. For me, as someone who's not a lawyer, I was a little bit surprised to find so much criticism in a way about the apartheid paradigm. I don't know. I mean, I understand that maybe there are some differences, but it almost seemed I don't know if it's true in terms of quantitatively, but it almost seemed that the report devotes more space, and it's not a lot of space, 23 pages. It's not like the Al-Haq report, which is 220 pages, this is a small report, so you have 23 pages, like, I don't know, 10, 12,000 words. I mean, so I'm saying, I mean, a lot of sections are devoted to criticism of those who use the apartheid paradigm, good criticism, but not enough criticism of, in my view, of, for example, the American government, or the Italian government, or the British government, or the EU. I mean, much more important players in relation to the oppression of the Palestinian people. And I think that it's better to basically try to address them, because they are the people that are important. The others, I mean, are quite, not that important. I'm trying to now say something about the fact about the paradigm of apartheid. So Pranč'seka writes, quote, "In recent years, a number of reputable scholars and organizations have concluded that systematic and widespread discriminatory Israeli policy and practices against the Palestinians amount to the crime of apartheid under international law." And then she says, this is very important for the report, "If considered alone and not as part of a holistic examination of the experiences of the Palestinian people as a whole, the apartheid framework presents some limitation." So one of the arguments here that the apartheid framework doesn't address the experiences of all the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians in exile, but I think that also the report doesn't do that. So in a way, people who adhere to the apartheid paradigm can reverse the charge here and say, well, okay, but also in this report, it doesn't come up. So it doesn't address the Palestinian people as a whole. And the other thing is that Pranč'seka says is that to focus, quote, to focus on Israeli apartheid alone misses the inherent illegality of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. But here I must ask Pranč'seka, because it was not clear to me, especially as I'm not a lawyer, why do you qualify and say that a focus on Israeli apartheid alone misses the inherent illegality of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem? It misses the occupation of all of Palestine. Why is this if we are going to phrase it in this way, right? And especially if we are going to adopt settler colonial studies comprehensively and honestly, then we cannot introduce this distinction because it almost amounts to a contradiction in terms. It's almost like trying to eat the cake and have it too. I mean, it's a little bit of an issue. And here also, I want to say that what I'm saying, it's another problem here, because once a person decides to step into the framework of the United Nations, right, there's a price to be paid. And the price to be paid is to come and try to say, for example, I mean, what is the difference between the occupied territories after 1967, 23% of
Chico, you asked me to interrupt you when you have one more minute left.
Thank you so much. So I'm saying, okay, so in 1967, the state of Israel occupied 23% of mandatory Palestine. And in 1948, it occupied 22% of mandatory Palestine. What I'm suggesting is there a difference, legal or otherwise, between these two occupations. I mean, and if there is, why? If there isn't, why? It's not clear. United Nations Resolution 181 and 194. I'm asking people here, Sausan, and I'm also asking Pranč'seka, do you think that they are legal? You know, I mean, are they legal or are they not legal? I mean, so these are issues that, I mean, I think must be addressed, and there's no way to evade them because this evasion, in a way, doesn't serve the purpose of bringing all of us together into some sort of a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chico. Now, Francesca, you have another 10 minutes and we're open for floor.
Yes, thank you both. And please, Amos, signal me when I have 2 minutes left, because I have a lot to say and it was very thought-provoking. So let me start with something that Susan mentioned, the holistic approach to to the various frameworks that have been proposed. I couldn't agree with her more. And in fact, I said in the report, and I keep on saying in my presentations, that the problem that I find in the attitude of the international community, and let me make a parenthesis here, I'm a UN special rapporteur. So when I wrote a book as a scholar, I addressed a variety of issues concerning the question of Palestinian refugees, didn't think of a specific audience. I thought of bringing out the facts. Here, I speak to the diplomatic community first and foremost in order to inform their decisions. So bear with me. My first and primary audience is this, and what I'm trying to do is to enlarge the debate, also to make other views heard. Now, when it comes to holistic approaches, I said everything that has been done so far until the proposal of the apartheid framework has been so sectorial. You had the United Nations commenting and producing reports on individual violations and recommending how to make the occupation more in line with international law. After 55 years, I mean, for me, this is ridiculous because an occupation shouldn't be there. People shouldn't be under martial law for 55 years. So this is why my call was for a comprehensive reading of the current situation. And let me clarify, I really don't know why that part of my report, building on the apartheid framework, has been so misunderstood, because Moshe, you are not the first one who makes this comment as if I had dismissed the apartheid framework. Not at all. I use it, in fact, as a building block over which we should all step to stick our head off the parapet and look at the landscape. What I say, and the reason why I say that the apartheid framework per se is not alone, but I say the same thing of the law of occupation or human rights law, we should apply international law in a holistic fashion. And I hoped to have brought some sense of it, is because the end of apartheid, and this is the greatest lesson that we can draw from South Africa, is that the end of apartheid is just like dismantlement of certain structure without contesting the authority in place, meaning Israel could continue to act as a sovereign in the occupied Palestinian territory, or even determining what is part of the territory it wants to exert sovereignty over, meaning the West Bank, not Gaza, which is nonsensical, which is illegal. And I look at 1967 because not only this is the starting point of my mandate, but this is also the starting point of the international community's full criticism of Israel's practices. Yes, there is a difference if you look at, and I'm not talking as an historian, I'm not talking from a moral point of view, I'm not talking as a human being, I'm talking as a lawyer and looking at what has happened inside the UN. The UN has dealt very differently with the territory, with the remainder of mandatory Palestine, and has recognized Israel. So Israel as a state, it has recognized Israel's existence and legitimacy over the large portions of mandatory Palestine, not on the West Bank, is Jerusalem and Gaza. Actually, not on West Bank, Gaza and Jerusalem. The entire Jerusalem is considered under international law corpus separatum. So even our distinction between East and West is fictitious in a way. But again, many aspects of my mandate are artificial and reflect the fragmentation that has been infused in our minds by the way the international community has approached the question. I cannot undo that. I need to live with the limitations of my mandate. But I've said, I will look at past events to an extent. I cannot investigate what happened in 1948 or pre-1948. This is why recommendation number 80 in my report refers to the Commission of Inquiry on Israel and Palestine and say, well, it's up to this commission who has a broader mandate to figure out what has happened to the right of self-determination, including in Israel, of all the people living there. I know it's a huge endeavor, and I think it's an endeavor toward everyone, legal scholars and non-legal scholars, philosophers, and other experts should contribute to. So I acknowledge the limitations of my mandate, but I try to make a good use of it, again, bringing some sense to an international community's discourse, which keeps on insisting, as I said, the mantra of the two-state solutions while condoning, normalizing an illegal occupation. And again, I think that history doesn't make jumps. We didn't get, this is in 2000's point of the current government. How did we get there? The presence of Israeli Israeli nationals, Jewish Israeli presence in the occupied territory, which was already legal in 1967, meaning in the form of, as it happened, in a form of transfer, a sustained economic process. This has been condemned. And this is to be our starting point, at least to get out of the impasse. The way we got there under various Israeli governments that had not the right-wing characteristic of the current one. So this is why we should look at it into an historical perspective. Again, please don't take anything I wrote in the report as a criticism of the apartheid framework. As I say, it's not valid. It's valid, but not sufficient. And the important lesson I was referring to in South Africa is in South Africa, white supremacy was questioned and sort of dismantled, but the structure of the supremacy was not dismantled. And this is why the problem was never addressed. Difference is the situation of Namibia, which was occupied. And again, this is more similar to the reality in the occupied Palestinian territory, military occupation. Now, again, not any history. I mean, every people and every geographic area has its own history. And yes, I'm almost done. Its own history. And again, I don't think we should look too much at the comparative experience, if not then as a form of inspiration and to look at lessons learned. And then one last point I wanted to make. Yes, I do criticize the fact that some reports used the right of self-determination or either the fate of the refugees are naturally falling outside the scope of the apartheid framework because they were political issues. And this is why I say the right of self-determination is a legal right with legal meaning and consequences and cannot be dismissed as a question of politics. When there is a dispute, you don't go to philosophers, you don't go to priests, etc. You go to lawyers. And this is why, again, I don't want to defend my role, but international law is a way, as especially human rights law, is a way to lead to pacification without further violations. This is what I feel like sharing.
Thank you very much, all three. Now we will open it for the floor to the audience, but two things. First, you were sent links to the report or to some summaries of it. So you can also refer to the report itself while asking not only to what was said. The second one, since we have like three screens, please raise your virtual hand and then you move to the first screen so I can see you. So please raise your hand in order to get your turn to speak. So who will go first?
Amos, while you collect, sorry.
If you have problems with the people who want to speak, I mean, I'm very happy to speak more.
So,
Amos, can I add something? Sorry, I just take less than 1 minute, because Moshe raised another point which is important, why I didn't question the role of European states or America. Because there is a report written by my predecessor in 2020, and I'll share the link, that focuses precisely on the role of the enablers. And my work is in continuity. But yes, of course, I will keep on insisting on that. Of course.
okay. I think Corinne is asking from Academia for
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, hi, thank you so much for this. It's really fascinating, and your report is really interesting. Since you are talking to this audience of non-lawyers, and I'm really glad you are bringing the importance of international law into this debate, I wonder what exactly, or if you can present to us, what exactly is your view of international law here? Like, how are we looking up to it, and why are we looking up to it when it failed so miserably in the past? So in what sense do you see it's a valuable, I mean, it's your profession and everything, but beyond that, for us as activists, for Palestinians, for Israeli activists, and so on. Thanks.
Okay, Francesca, you go. Yanni also has a question, so perhaps we'll have two and then you will answer.
Well, thank you, Francesca, for this presentation and for your report. I admittedly have read only parts of it, but I want to make a comment. I found the report ambivalent in its discussion. And perhaps what you say about the limits of your mandate explains this ambivalence. Because on the one hand, you criticize the two-state solution as inadequate or insufficient. But on the other hand, you put forward the framework of the right of self-determination. And that's a way of reintroducing the two-state solution. The right of self-determination, unless we take it, and you don't take it in this way, unless we take it as a territorial right, rather than a national or ethnic right. But you don't do that. You speak of self-determination not in territorial terms, not the self-determination of everyone who lives in Israel, Palestine, but the self-determination of Palestinians vis-a-vis the self-determination of the Jews. Well, that's two-state discourse. And so reading your report leaves us with ambivalence, because you have penchant criticism of the two-state solution as it is as it has come down to us in international diplomatic discourse. And of course, there's much to criticize, but beyond criticism of the failure of the international community to get the two-state solution going, we are still in your report within that framework. I'm not, for this, I don't want to criticize you, because I don't think there's a very clear or practical alternative to it. But of course, people have been speaking about the one-state solution and about interim solutions like the confederal solutions. But anyway, I found your criticism interesting, but then not conclusive, and essentially it falls back on the two-state solution. Thank you.
Francesca, go ahead and...
Yeah, thank you so much. Two really important questions. So, Karin, right? Karin, my my view of international law, it's not a pure, it's not as pure and genuine as we would like to, in the sense that international law has been historically used as an instrument to subjugate. We are in a different era now, in the one that was inaugurated by the UN Charter and the post-war war, the order that emerged out of the ashes of the Second World War. And the principles that new international law carried with it. Not all the inconsistencies of international law have been overcome, because I do believe that international law is a sort of a neutral vehicle that gets the direction of those who are in the driving seat. And here is the tension. I still think that we live in a world order dominated by sorry to say, I am a European, by Europeans, by people who have made settler colonialism part of their own history, Canada, the United States, Australia. And this is why settler colonialism, going back to what Sausan was saying, has never been condemned as such. Colonialism was not settler colonialism per se, but it boils down to the fact that today, thanks to human rights law, this is an instrument to improve people's life based on universalities of values. And like if you were behind the John Rawls veil of ignorance, determining the situation of everyone based on what everyone would like to achieve for him or herself. But international law, with its values and high principles, is as strong as the willingness of states to enforce it. So there is a double effort here that we have to make as human rights community. And I'm really glad I'm having this discussion with you, particularly with you, all of you who are in Israel tonight, because we need to feel part of the same community of intent to make it happen. As Hagai Elad of Bet Selmelem says, and I often quote him on this, human rights are for human beings. And this is my ultimate drive as a lawyer. Make international law closer to justice than to power. This is our challenge. And sorry, you asked me a difficult question. And Yanni, you're right. I wonder why no one has asked me this question before. But let me make a precision. I do not criticize the two-state solution. I criticize the Oslo Accords and the interpretation of, I criticize the Oslo Accords because they have never been conceived to realize the self-determination of the Palestinian people, because the Madrid framework was very different and could have led to that. And I'm very agnostic on which form of states should take place. I don't think it's to anyone, especially the foreigners, to determine this. But here's really spontaneously, and the food for thought, this is the way I think. I see this in terms as a Hegelian dialectic. The thesis, my thesis, is the occupation must be dismantled because it operates brutally outside what is permitted by international law. We cannot fix all problems of the world or of Israel and Palestine altogether. So let's start by these, because at least there is international consensus on the fact that the occupation since 1967, the military troops should have been withdrawn. So let's start from this. And so this is the starting point, like the antithesis of this is the removal of the occupation. Now, the higher proposition, the Hegelian synthesis should be determined by the people who live there. Israeli, Palestinians, Jewish, Christian, Muslims. But once the suprematism, the supremacy that now lays, with the Israelis, is dismantled in the occupied Palestinian territory. Then again, let's have the discussion about what happens in Israel at another point. I still think that the right of the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, the right of self-determination is not fully realized, but because it means full recognition of minority rights to exist economically, politically, socially, and culturally as a group. And this apparently doesn't happen. But I don't have, seriously, I didn't document that because my mandate prohibits me from doing this. So again, it's not, I don't think, Yanni, to conclude that there is necessarily a contradiction in the report, but yes, I decided to stop where the international law and consensus is. Like, let's start from dismantling the occupation.
Can I add though another comment? What you envisioned now is an end of the occupation, which is disconnected from a positive vision of what will come after it. And I doubt very much that that is a viable program. To dismantle the occupation is to come upon another arrangement, a different arrangement. What would that be? Is an issue that has to be settled concomitantly. I doubt very much that there is political space for what you propose. That is, first dismantle, and then think about what the solution would be. The only thing that comes close to it that I can think of is, and that is a catastrophe, of course, that was the Israeli unilateral withdrawal from Gaza and the imposition of a siege upon that area, and that's of course catastrophic. So I don't know that you can do this, that you can, first dismantle and then rearrange. These things have to, they are inseparable from one another. They are intertwined in a way that is, I doubt that it is possible to separate. Well, I've taken too much time.
Okay, so now we have Oren who wanted to ask a question, and then David, and then Hila and Chaim. So let's start with Oren and David, and try to keep your question. Oren doesn't, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm here in Firenze, Prančesca, in your homeland of Italy. And the question is about the effectiveness. It follows on the other questions. How will this report about settler colonialism, which obviously many of us share as a historical condition, how will it better the situation of reaching Palestinian self-determination, as opposed to the apartheid paradigm that already is created a paradigm shift? And in the human rights community, at least, this is the consensus now. So there is a focal point of effort that may be more effective, because it's an international crime against humanity to fight the Israeli supremacy, than introducing a new paradigm of colonialism, which is much vaguer in terms of international law. So what is the difference you're trying to make? We want to clarify that, and how can we join efforts and still not lose the momentum that the paradigm report that, I was one of the writers of the B'Tselem report, have to reveal that, momentum that is already created in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take one more question by David Kretschmer. David?
You're on
Unmute,
mute, David.
unmute.
I have a somewhat different approach, and it flows from the discussion that we've had here. Let me say, like Oren, I don't dispute your report. I think that if it were...
Oren, mute yourself, Oren.
If it were an academic report, it would be a good basis for discussion, and we could go on with the kind of discussion that we've had here. My problem is that there are people being killed in the occupied territories every single day. We are now going to have a government which is about to go ahead and take over even more of the Palestinian land that has been done up to now. We need urgent action at the moment. In my mind, not debates about what the actual correct way of analyzing the situation is. And from my perspective, I would have assumed that the main role of the special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council for the occupied territories would find ways of giving international protection to the Palestinians at this very moment, and not opening up a debate which, you know, is going to just give all the kind of doubts, and everybody's going to come back. This is the right paradigm. This is not the right paradigm. We should extend it. It's not only the occupied territories. It's what I accept your mandate is the occupied territories. That's all that I have to say.
Okay, Francesca, go ahead, and then we have another round of 3 questions.
Yes, again, trust me, this focus, I've not proposed a new paradigm. I've just said that the occupation is illegal and reminds of settler colonialism. I've not proposed a new paradigm alternative. And in fact, I keep on saying that the anti-apartheid movement is forming, and this is what is going to bring down. I have faith that we are all going to see the end of it. Maybe I'm the last optimist in the world, but I do believe it. The debate, the focus, I'm sorry to say, I don't take it as a criticism, but the focus on settler colonialism is being picked up, particularly in discussions with Israelis. Because in fact, if you read, I encourage you to read at least one thing, the recommendations of my report. I call for, I describe the reality in the OPT as an evolving and degrading microcosm of abuses. Sorry, I lost it. I call for the deployment of an international protection force, because there is no reason to maintain and to believe that the Israeli army will bring the situation back to a situation of normalcy where human rights can be enjoyed. So again, can we move on? Now I understand why the few Israelis who had read my report and commented on it said, this reference to settler colonialism is going to derail the debate with Israelis. Okay, mea culpa. But again, what I said is the apartheid discourse is legitimate, and as a special rapporteur, building on the work of my predecessor, whose last report was about apartheid, I built on it. I carried it forward. I've denounced apartheid even before being a special rapporteur. But as a special rapporteur, I thought that there was an element that was missing. And again, the international community, which says, oh yeah, we are all for the realization of the 2 states. Which 2 states? Because if you want to realize a state must be the blossoming of the right of self-determination. And again, the apartheid reality is a consequence of the features that the occupation in the OPT has. I hope it's clear. I'm sorry if it's not, but I will continue to insist and to discuss with all of you. I really want to be an ally in this and not someone who divert the discussion. Not at all. On David, and again, I also think that it builds on what David said. So it's not it's an additional element and not something that drives the discussion away. Thanks.
Now it's Chaim, and then Hila, and then Itamar. And that will be the next round. And if you have it, please raise your hand for the next round.
I want to thank Francesca for a report which I may be in a minority in this group, I don't know, because no other voices have been heard. But I find the report excellent because it covers the range of topics and the range of positions, and also the range of models that it does. And it's richer for that. And I want to say that if in 1947, Francesca was sent to check the situation in Palestine, we wouldn't be here today. And the Palestinians wouldn't be under occupation today. The UN sent a very bad group of people, friends of friends, and they wrote a report which was not worth the paper written on it. This is not the case now. So I think, like David, I'm very frightened of what is going to follow, because you finished the report even before this terrifying move in Israel. And if you were writing it today, you would have more to write, that's for sure, and more to be worried about. Now, I don't think that by speaking about self-determination, we are speaking about a state necessarily, or that we're speaking about ethno-nationalism, which are the two main positions that were represented here. There are many examples, some which have been mentioned, for self-representation, which is not built on those two concepts. And if some people asked you, why did you not resolve the solution in the Middle East? I think that's a naive position. The UN resolved the situation in 1947 in the way that we know, and the Palestinians are suffering to this very day. So if we need to worry about self-determination, first, we need to worry about the self-determination of the Palestinians, which is being denied since 1947 and even before by the British controlling. So I am not asking questions, I'm actually speaking to support the report as it stands, incomplete and imperfect by definition because of the mandate that you were given, and incomplete and imperfect because international law is incomplete and imperfect. But as you said, what you want is to take the international law as close as to a just peace as possible. And I can think and mention just one possibility, that the conflict can be resolved positively without ethno-nationalism, and that is a state of all its citizens, rather than a binational state that is bringing in ethno-nationalism. I just want to end by saying that we cannot look for miraculous solutions coming from the UN. What we can do is ask the UN to correct the mistake that they have made in 1947, for which the Palestinians are paying every day. And this is what this report is doing.
Thank you, Chaim. Now Hila, and then Itamar.
Yes, thank you so much, Francesca. And also thank you so much, Sausan and Chico, for such a brilliant interventions. Thank you. Francesca, I want to give you perhaps an opportunity to lead us through the corridors of power by asking whether you, in your position when you were conceiving the report, you were also, I'm speaking now as one of the co-founders of Academia for Equality and as an Israeli, but also someone living in Europe and being active in Europe. So did you, when you conceived the report, consider how Israel is using self-determination to silence Palestinian voices, how Israel is manipulating this concept in order to, like, there's no way to be a Palestinian and to have a Palestinian voice in Europe without this being an immediate threat perceived by mainstream Europe as a denial of the self-determination of the Jews. I'm just asking this in order to see whether you also had in mind that minefield that we are living in the context of an international struggle for Palestinian rights.
Itamar.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for the report. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the right to self-determination, which it seems to me like one of the locations of the disagreement that some of us are expressing is about, on the one hand, kind of saying that self-determination is at the center of how people should understand the occupation and the regime. And on the other hand, that discussing how that self-determination will be realized is left out of the report. And it's this boundary, which is, the same boundary, the 1967-48 boundary. So I'm just wondering also, since you said the state should be the blossoming of the right to self-determination, just because I don't know about international law, really other forms of self-determination that international law recognizes? Are there other forms of self-determination that international law recognizes in relation to Jews and Palestinians in the land? I mean, this is also, I think, an important political question because, you know, as we're emerging out of the era of the two states as like the go-to paradigm, Israeli Jews that we talk to as activists are interested to know, okay, you know, like at least the two-state solution had a kind of like a symmetry, you know, we want them to have a state just like we have a state, right? And us, those of us here who are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist have critiqued that because of the issue of minority rights. So can you say more about the right to self-determination as international law understands it? And yeah.
Sure. Amos, is it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Haim. I'm enjoying this discussion. I have to say that when we started, I was shaking because it's not easy to be. This is the first time I think that it ever happens that a special rapporteur has engaged with on the OPT has engaged with the Israeli scholars, and this has been my dream from the very beginning. My dream, and said I need to make it happen because as a special rapporteur, I want to create space for inclusion and for different voices. And I keep on insisting, the occupation is corrosive and corrupting, not only for those who are under occupation, but for those, especially the youth, who are there administering and delivering it day in and day after. And this is something that I've learned over time by also reading recent contemporary Israeli scholarship like Nurit Peled. So I'm not taking what you are saying as a criticism to the report, also because I'm used to harsher treatment from Israelis, not you, of course, but which leads me, and one thing, I think that had I been there in 1948, I would have ended like the UN mediator, Folke Bernadotte, because eventually it's true what Haim was saying. The UN back then was a club. It was not the representation of a democratic order. The world back then was still colonized, divided between colonizers and colonized. So taking a piece of land for Balfour and saying, oh, this place inhabited by Bedouin, yes, let's solve, as Furin Minajar, I think it's said in Arabic, we solve one problem, which is anti-Semitism in Europe. And at the same time, it was totally normal, not even to think of the local the majority Arabs, Jews, Christians, and Palestinians like other than subject. But today we are not there. We cannot change history. We cannot change why the international community decided not to question the entitlement to the majority of the Jews who ended up in Israel, in what was pre-1948 Israel in Palestine. We cannot question why the international community decided to say, okay, let's give it a state to the Jews, or let's give the Arab a state. We can do that, but it's not conducive. Let's use the sensitivity of today, of those grandchildren, of those who survived the persecution against the Jews in Europe and carry those values to understand how to undo the horror, as David Kretzmer was saying, the reality of the endured by the Palestinians in the OPT. And this leads me to Hila's point. If I've been thinking of how Israel uses the question of self-determination to silence any criticism against its practices, personally, not really, because I'm on the receiving end of how Israel uses anti-Semitism as a way to silence every form of criticism. It's disconcerting. It's violent beyond a person can handle. Tell me, because the reason why I was shaking as I started to think is that in my mind there was this idea: how many of these people think that I'm an anti-Semite? And again, this is just in order to describe the chilling effect that is produced on all of us, but we can make it better. Now, I do think that it's important to discuss how the different claims to self-determination came to conflict and or coexist. But let me tell you what is my take in the OPT. In the OPT, and this is something that might upset people, but as a human rights lawyer, this is what I say. When I say decolonization, for example, has a very specific meaning for me, and it might not be what Moshe would argue, because I've read something you wrote about settler colonialism and decolonization, and it's fascinating, but it's also new to me. I come from a different paradigm where decolonization is simply the removal of a suprematism structure without questioning all those that necessarily has brought to it. Both our contributions are necessary. But in the OPT, should there be a Palestinian state, none of those who are considered settlers illegal under international law today, not every one of those 800 should be forcefully removed. Because there are people who have been living there for 50 years and there is jurisprudence in international law that demonstrates that there is an acquisition of rights as a community in a place. But if there was a Palestinian state, a free Palestinian state, then those Jews who remain there would be not citizens of Israel. I mean, they might also be citizens of Israel, but in the West Bank and in Gaza, they would be under Palestinian law. Alternatively, if there was one state, again, this is not something that I can say as a foreigner. This is something that, first of all, the Palestinians should say once they are out of the yoke of domination that oppresses them today. And then once they are on an equal footing with the Jewish Israelis, it's up to them and up to you to decide what kind of final setting you want to have. But we need to go through the acceptance of like a step-by-step approach. This is my take. Itamar, I do hope that this also clarifies some of my, answers your question. I know it's not comprehensive, and I'm not trying. Yes, one comment I might have. The right of self-determination doesn't necessarily take place, or is not always recognized as the right to have a state. It's not the right to secession. And actually, it was initially recognized as minority rights to prevent the fragmentation of Europe at the time. Boundaries according to ethnic lines had already proven as a failure. So what I would say is that self-determination, for example, for the Palestinians in Israel today, would be full recognition of minority rights. Does it exist? Are they protected as a minority? Or are they discriminated against as a minority? And this is the question, because if the answer is they are discriminated as a minority, it means that their right of self-determination is not realized. So statehood, yes, but not necessarily. Right of self-determination can express itself in other ways.
Okay, now we have 5 minutes left. So first Merav and then Maya, and I think then we will have to wrap up.
Okay, and first of all, I want to join everybody else who thank you for the report and for your fresh perspective, Francesca, and for the lively discussion and for engaging with this group. And I just I think that some of the people who spoke before me already highlighted sometimes the catch that we're in when we're trying to find the right tools to battle the continuation of the situation, and each framework has its own strengths and limitations. As you said, none of them are a magic solution, and at the risk of joining this race to the bottom, I also want to highlight some of the issues that come with a call to ending the occupation and the risks that we run with that, not only in terms of its geographical scope, obviously, but also when it comes to the lessons we learned from Gaza and what we're seeing now happening in the West Bank, whereas Israel is reconfiguring a lot of its forms of control, both politically and legally, in a way that will not be recognized as an occupation per se, without relinquishing control and definitely without bringing about self-determination. So I just wanted to highlight that even that call for ending the occupation could be a double bind. But thanks again for having this discussion.
Okay, now Maya.
I
If you
want
can
to join. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the report, and thank you very much for this fascinating presentation and for the organizers as well. Just a quick question or something I was wondering, because the UN recognized Palestinian right for self-determination years ago, and since 1974 there is a series of decisions that repeated the recognition of the UN, starting with recognition for self-determination, going on to recognition of the right to statehood, and then culminating later in 1988, when actually the UN, the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, actually accepted the Palestinian program, peace program, and with the idea of first dismantling the occupation. And there was general support for this, and there was a vote that actually adopted this decision with the support of all the states, all member states, I think with the exclusion of two, the US and Israel, inclusion of all European states. So there was a decision calling for Palestinian, the establishment of Palestinian state, of course, based on the right of Palestinians for self-determination, and for a proposal that in the meantime, before the establishment of Palestinian state, there will be a UN force that will replace the Israeli military. Okay, so probably, I mean, what I'm saying is we are now, that was in 1988, in I think December 1988, historical decision. And now it's, I think, 35 years since then, okay? And so actually, what you are doing in your report, you are revitalizing something that has already been agreed upon. And what I want to ask is, what is your opinion about this? Because actually there is something very wrong here with how things went wrong. Okay, thanks.
So before I let you talk, Francesca, answer or refer, we will stay 15 minutes till 9:45 Palestine-Israel time. And before we wrap up within this 15 minutes, I will also give Sausan and Chico an opportunity to give some concluding remarks of their own. So Francesca, go ahead.
Yeah, there is also Yanni with his hand raised. I don't know if he has a question, but
Meron will also ask you after. We have another round.
Okay. Let me ask Maya's question first, and then I'll go to Merav's. Again, this is a very critical point, and the reason why many links are not fully explained in the report is because I had the limit of 10,700 words, and I had to fight and find escamotages to make sure that discussion was coherent. So I didn't have the freedom to write in like human rights organizations report. So take this into account and bear with me. But one thing that got missed is how the concept of statehood had come into question, and the fact that indeed, if we look at the discussion since 1967 in the UN, the question of Palestine has always been understood as a question of or discussed as a question of decolonization. I mean, I refer to the OPT, because the Palestinians have always, since the very beginning, since the post-Nakba, have always called for full liberation, and then this is adopted because things have changed. So there has been a readjustment of the mind. But in the OPT, yes, the discussion was, yeah, what do you mean? The occupation after 5 years is not necessarily just an occupation for security reasons. And the idea of the gradual idea that formed within the Palestinian, within the PLO's mind first, and then others, as I read it, I'm not an historian, but as I read it through the report of the UN, is that there was an understanding that the statehood would have been a compromise, at least for the question of self-determination. As a people, as a whole, the state of Palestine will be for the Palestinian people what Israel is for the Jewish people, not a state that represents all the Jews, because there are Jews in the EU, in the US, and they might not want to come to Israel, or they might want to go back to Israel, while Israel should also protect its non-Jewish citizens. And same thing would have been for the state of Palestine. What has happened is against what I call the Oslo trap. Oslo was not the best way to realize self-determination. It was a departure from the idea of the two-state solution that Palestinian intellectuals primarily and decision makers in the PLO had been concocting, because, you know, Oslo came about. And this is the trick, because since Oslo, the international community has kicked the can in the air saying, you see, there is a self-determination for the Palestinians. It's not fully realized, but because, yeah, there are problems. They don't manage to reach an agreement. And all of a sudden, in the public discourse around Palestine and Israel changed with the impression that the two were equal. And today, when I tell people, yeah, but one is the occupier, the other one is the occupied, in Italy, for example, where 30 years ago, there was a clear understanding of the situation, where there was clear support for the right of the Palestinian to self-determination while recognizing the right of Israel to exist. This is the cultural humus I grew up, the cultural, let's say, landscape I grew up in. Now, no, because claiming the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people is infringing upon the rights of Israel to exist. Again, this is how far the debate has derailed. And yes, I try to bring it back, but especially to push Europeans to be consistent and coherent and to walk the talk. This is what I'm trying to, this is the enablers. This is what I'm trying to do.
One second. Okay.
Yeah.
But actually the framework exists, okay? Yeah. The UN has never gone back from these decisions. All these resolutions remain in place, so they actually have to be enforced. I mean, there is a situation here which is something here is really tricky in a way, because it's just like there is a framework in place, and what you are trying to say is actually that you see the point here, because the 35 years have been wasted, but the framework is there. And there is even a program how to implement it.
Yeah.
So this is just, I'm sorry if I'm...
No, Maya, you're totally right. But again, there is another issue today, and I had not got the full sense of it until I I presented physically my first report to the General Assembly, because one thing is what you perceive from seeing the voting patterns, etc. Israel, sorry to say, but Israel is very strong in hijacking the debate in the UN. Is the Israeli ambassador I think he still fierce because he's so vociferous and also how to say in a nice way, yes, vociferous in criticizing anyone who attempts to put in question what Israel does in the OPT. You cannot open that debate. It's very far away. So this is why we need to stick to each other. We do not need to disperse as a human rights community. We do not need to disperse efforts. I agree with you. And we learn from each other's mistakes. We build it together. But we need to bring the discussion back to where it was. And now it's not there. And you know, Maya, the proof of what I'm saying is that still you have votes on a resolution on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, and member states like the US vote against. Yes, how can it be that someone votes against the peremptory norm of the international law, something which is recognized to every people, including to the Palestinian people, by its own admission, meaning UN own admission? Now, going back to Maya's question, you see, even for me, it's interesting the way this question, even ending the occupation, could be problematic. And why? Why so? Meaning, I know it's a rhetorical question, mine, but why in the name of a people's security, another people's security and also their rights should be sacrificed? There are communities which fight. I believe that the Israelis and the Palestinians, the moment these there will be dialogue again, will be available to teach a lesson. They will South Africanize the apartheid framework. I do believe that this can happen. But the thing is that now we are not even capable of envisaging a reality where Israel accepts not to control parts of the occupied territory, because for me, Gaza is occupied. The very fact that Israel determines many aspects of the Gazans' life and maintains a blockade, hey, this is not disengagement. I mean, it's just uprooting of some people who are living there in a violent fashion, in a way that is not compliant with international standards, but it's not disengagement in the sense, okay, we just keep control of the OPT. The all occupied Palestinian territory is still occupied. And the problem is that until the international community continues to disregard international law, which obliges member states to disengage from commercial relations, I mean, take political, diplomatic, economic measures, not toward the Israelis, toward the Israeli government that apply the given policies. Until international law keeps on being treated as an option, this is the reality we will face.
Okay, so Meron, then...
Sorry, can I just clarify very quickly?
But we have like really 6 more minutes, and Meron is impatiently sitting and I also want to ask a question. And I will ask, so it will be Meron, Shiko, and Sausan, and then Prančesca will conclude.
I don't want to hijack, good evening, and thank you for the presentation. I don't want to hijack the discussion, but still, from my point of view, as one of the leaders of Two States, One Homeland, Land for All, that supports a confederation, EU model, like between Israel and independent Palestine. How do you see that in the framework of the right for self-determination? Does it infringe on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian, or you see it as going according to international law?
Chico?
Sorry, first of all, I think that despite the fact that I'm not part of the scheme that Meron and visions, because I have some reservation. I think that his question is very, very important, because my answer would be that his frame can facilitate Palestinian self-determination, I think, but that's not for me. I just want to say two things, if I may, Fran-Cesca, to Chaim, who is a veteran observer of Palestine, Israel, and whom I respect, and also to David Kretschmer, also someone that I respect because they are like teachers for me. David, I think that your point is very important. I want to summarize it by quoting David Bowie. You are saying this is ground control to Major Tom. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that all of us, in a way, sometimes I feel that we maybe lose the link to the material reality, not only of the West Bank, and this is important. So thank you for the words. And Chaim, I mean, the only thing I want to say is that when Fran-Cesca speaks about the right for self-determination, right? Unfortunately, in 2022, I don't think that there is a viable way to escape ethno-nationalism. I just don't see it, you know what I mean? Ethno-nationalism, Brexit, Italy, Sweden, it's not going to disappear. It is here. So what I'm saying is that I think that the discussion is important because we need to confront it somehow, you know? And this is why I conclude.
Unmute.
You're muted, Chico.
I just sent in the chat another story. It's a long quote, not too long, but this is Edward Said from 1999. In some respects, the essay that did trigger the discussion about alternative to partition, that triggered the discussion about one state. And I think that since Edward's death in 2003 and 4, and the exiling of Dr. Azmi Bshara in 2007 by the State of Israel, from these 2 points, the first decade of the 21st century, the discussion on Palestine-Israel completely, you know, went to directions that are completely not productive. That's my view. And we need to go back to Edward Said and Azmi Bshara, because they are the two individuals that can envision a way out of the mess. Thank you.
Okay, Dosan.
Yes, thank you again, Fran-Cesca, and for everyone for all the comments. I also don't want to hijack the response. I think a report of a UN special rapporteur can be inclusive to a certain point. And as you said, Fran-Cesca, you have the limit of the words and the limit of the pages, and we can't throw everything to one report of a UN special rapporteur. And I think that I am now in a timing that I am also on a practical level very concerned of how to translate the important recommendations that are included in your report, Fran-Cesca. How can they be translated to actions and remedies and steps undertaken by the international community? The fact that, and this is frankly, this is what, because we can talk on a political and philosophical level, I don't think that we are now in a timing that we have the privilege to continue talking on a philosophical level, not even on an interpretation of what framework works better, because we don't have this privilege now with the new government. Not that the previous governments were better, of course they were not better, they were like harsh Zionist governments, but the slippery slope that we will go into now, I think obliges us to start thinking of how to translate the recommendations in this report and in other reports to actual steps in order to achieve a holistic justice for Palestinians. So that's my take, and sorry, I'm not that optimistic.
Okay, Francesca, 2 minutes of last remarks and we will wrap up.
I feel too bad toward Merav because I think that she asked a question and I missed it. And I'm sorry, but please, let's continue separately. My bad. I admit that I'm not sure I understand fully Meron's approach. And I'm very happy to learn. Again, I think I agree with those who said it's time to protect the people on the ground. It's in everyone's interest. It's not the Palestinian. I keep on saying, and this is my last remark. For too long, people internationally have learned to understand the reality in Israel-Palestine as a conflict among rivals, like conflicting identities and values. It's not like that. And the discussion we are having is a proof of this. So let's start by this. Let's start with knowing what our role is to prevent that 2023 is a replication, if not a worsening of what happened in 2022 with the level of death and expropriation and displacement and brutalization of a people that has no means to protect itself. So as Gramsci would say, yes, I sound very optimistic, but thinking of a future action, but I remain also pessimistic, knowing how humanity can go wrong. I just would like to leave you with a message saying I'm on the side of everyone who stands for justice and human rights for all. So I hope this is just the beginning of a rich and productive continuous learning and work together.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Thank you very much, Shiko and Tausan. And of course, thank you very much, the organizers and all the participants. So good night, as good as this could be.
Yeah, thank you so much. Toda rabba.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.